Emotional conditioning is the mechanism through which early interference becomes internalized loyalty conflict. But to regulate emotion itself in order to preserve attachment security. In parental alienation dynamics, emotional conditioning operates at the level of affect, anticipation, and identity rather than at the level of conscious decision-making. From a developmental perspective, children are dependent systems. Their emotional regulation is scaffolded by caregivers, and their sense of safety is embedded within relational feedback loops. When emotional access to a caregiver becomes contingent on alignment, the child's internal regulatory strategies reorganize accordingly. Emotional conditioning occurs through repeated associations between emotional expression and relational consequence. When a child expresses affection, curiosity, or enjoyment related to one parent and encounters emotional discomfort in the other caregiver, such as anxiety, sadness, withdrawal, or agitation, that affect becomes paired with relational threat. Conversely, when the child suppresses those expressions and emotional equilibrium is restored, suppression is reinforced. Over time, the child's emotional system learns which internal states are safe to experience and which must be inhibited. This process is implicit. It does not rely on explicit instruction, moral reasoning, or conscious threat. Instead, it functions through anticipatory regulation. The child begins to feel anxiety not after expressing affection, but before. Emotional suppression becomes preemptive. Affect is managed internally to avoid destabilizing the caregiving environment. As conditioning continues, the child's emotional range narrows. Expressions of joy become restrained. Sadness is concealed or displaced. Anger may be redirected or flattened. These changes are often misinterpreted as emotional maturity or resilience. From a developmental standpoint, they represent defensive adaptation. The child is prioritizing relational safety over emotional authenticity. Loyalty conflict emerges when emotional conditioning is paired with attachment dependency. The child internalizes a rule that maintaining closeness with one caregiver threatens the stability of the other relationship. This conflict is not experienced as a cognitive dilemma, but as chronic physiological tension. The child resolves this tension by altering emotional expression and attachment behavior. Once internalized, the loyalty bind no longer requires external reinforcement. The child self-monitors and self-corrects. This is a critical transition point because it marks the shift from external pressure to internal constraint. Parentification frequently accompanies this stage. The child becomes attuned to the caregiver's emotional state and assumes responsibility for maintaining it. The child may justify restrictions, minimize personal needs, or articulate adult concerns using adult language. This role reversal collapses developmental boundaries and adds moral obligation to emotional dependence. In such contexts, autonomy becomes psychologically unavailable. Emotional conditioning also reshapes cognition and narrative. Children seek coherence. When emotional contingencies reward certain interpretations of relational history, the child's narrative reorganizes to reduce dissonance. Positive experiences with the targeted parent become minimized or reinterpreted. Negative experiences become generalized. This narrative shift is not deliberate distortion. It is coherence seeking under constraint. Memory processes are similarly affected. Children's autobiographical memory is reconstructive and sensitive to authority and repetition. Memory aligns with the emotional rules governing safety. This alignment stabilizes the system, but compromises accuracy. As loyalty conflict deepens, ambivalence becomes intolerable. Secure attachment allows for mixed feelings. Conditioned systems do not. Ambivalence produces internal instability. A child resolves this instability by simplifying emotional positions. One attachment is idealized and emotionally safe. The other becomes associated with threat or distress. This simplification restores equilibrium at the cost of relational complexity. This process is often mistaken for preference. From an emotional conditioning perspective, it is avoidance learning. The child is avoiding affective states that produce relational risk. Importantly, emotional conditioning does not require negative behavior from the targeted parent. The child's suppression is anticipatory. It reflects learned contingencies in the controlling environment rather than direct experience during contact. As a result, even consistently supportive interactions may fail to counteract conditioning when the broader emotional system remains unchanged. When institutional responses treat loyalty conflict as volitional or moral, they inadvertently reinforce conditioning. A child's suppression is validated as choice. Alignment is rewarded as insight. The controlling contingencies remain intact. From a systems perspective, emotional conditioning explains why interventions focused solely on the child often fail. These approaches target beliefs or behavior without altering the emotional consequences that shape regulation. The child cannot safely express ambivalence until the contingencies governing safety are changed. Understanding emotional conditioning reframes the phenomenon of parental alienation. What appears as rejection is the downstream result of effective learning. What appears as certainty is the resolution of internal conflict. What appears as maturity is emotional constriction. Loyalty conflict persists because it is adaptive in the short term. It reduces anxiety, preserves connection, and restores emotional predictability. The developmental cost, however, is significant. Chronic suppression, identity fragmentation, and constrained attachment undermine long-term relational functioning. Recognizing emotional conditioning and loyalty shifts analytic focus away from intent and toward process. It highlights that the child is not choosing between parents, but regulating exposure to emotional threat. The child's behavior reflects survival within a constrained relational field. Until emotional contingencies change, loyalty conflict cannot resolve. The child's system is doing exactly what it is designed to do under pressure. And that is why loyalty conflict in parental alienation contexts must be understood not as defiance or decision-making, but as conditioned emotional regulation within an attachment-dependent system.